control is, we'll talk in the 5th class to consolidate this, but it's pretty closely held, okay?
So was it no or yes?
No.
No.
Not one, but very closely held.
So the answer is
But if you put investors or shareholders, it's not one.
Shareholders?
It's not one.
There's-
Oh, it was an S on that.
Okay.
With S,
All right.
it's not one.
Okay, there were 3 different segments reported. The question was, is there one that's a bigger benefit or drag? And obviously, home building's like the 800-pound gorilla here. That's the only one that matters. So if you got a group that's losing $1 million a year, but you're making 80 in the other one, it may be a drag, but it's not material. That would be my answer. But it's insignificant.
I mean, it is a decent price.
It doesn't, but but anyway, listen, I'm not gonna we got a lot of material, so here's the point on the next one. These people are highly concentrated. There are home builders all over the country that are not. The largest home builders in this country are not concentrated. And so, the question, you've got, whatever, Toll Brothers or whatever, and they've got operations in all these places, right? So the question that I ask is, what are the positives and negatives? And most of you got the positives, right? So you got market knowledge, right? You got focus management, you got, proximity to clients, yada, connections with governments, yada, yada, yada. What are the downsides of this? What are the downsides of this versus something like this? And it's scalability. It's the ability to spread fixed costs over a much broader footprint or platform, right? So all your IT, all your HR, all your accounting and financial reporting, and I'm going to give you one more over and above that is purchasing power and control, and the ability to push contracts at a national level as opposed to a local level. And that's the only thing that I think some of you missed, is you saw the positives of the concentration, but I didn't see the positives of, that sort of spoke where all of the common services are in one place, okay? Backlog. I was surprised because I was very clear cut. Backlog was easy. Contracts without delivery. So you got a contract, but you haven't delivered on your end of obligation. My question, what's the process, blah, 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 blah. That's all out of the book. You can get that. What's a trend? And how do you reach your conclusion? So, for the most part, management was of the opinion that they had very positive trends and all that, but the one thing I didn't get from anybody was there are 2 sides, 2 edges to backlog.
You didn't read mine.
Okay, I didn't read you, but I don't want to get into that. What?
Mine talks about that. Mine.
Cancellation?
Without the S. Without the S. Mine talks about that.
The cancellation
The downside to the...
Which is?
Huh?
Which is?
Well, the one that I spoke about, the downside was that if you do start getting cancellations,
Keep going.
cancellations on that could pull from the expected revenues of that particular year.
The cancellation rate has gone from 4.7.
Okay, I think that is my humble opinion. I think you're missing the boat on what nobody else in the class addressed,
Okay.
which is, so it's great to have backlog because you think that you've got future revenue. And what have we talked about? What's the converse of tax? You want to push off revenue and accelerate expenses. What do you want to do in real life? You want to accelerate revenue. The downside of backlog is if backlog keeps going up, what does that mean? You're leaving money on the table. You're not delivering. You're going to lose customers because, time is risk. And the push-pull in any business is, how do I ramp up so I don't get bloated, so when the cycle turns on me, right? But without leaving money on the table, because at the end of the day, is the faster you can churn through those homes, right? The more you can deliver other homes. And the quicker, I got 400 contracts. Well, I'd rather have those closed sales. You know, that would be, so anyway, that would just, one thing that I would add to CDDs. CDDs are local special purpose governments, governmental units, right, created under the District Act of Florida Uniform Community Development District Act of 1980. Basically, a CDD is an entity that is created. It functions or acts as a governmental entity. It is used by developers. Its primary function is to develop common infrastructure on master plan, developments. Right? But the value of all of this is that it's a financing vehicle, right? It allows developers the ability to float bonds on a tax exempt, although that's under challenge now, tax exempt basis, right? So it was the ability for a developer to get cheaper money to build infrastructure, okay? The question or the answer that a lot of you had was, well, that's a way for a developer to push costs down to tenants. Yes and no. Yes and no, okay? And these bonds have kind of, or these districts are kind of falling in disfavor, they're kind of coming back, but, so, a lot of developers created these A bonds and B bonds, some of which in residential developments, they were pushing down to home buyers, right? But then what was happening? A home buyer was buying a house and they were getting clocked with this huge obligation for infrastructure that they didn't know about, okay?
No, yeah, but when you sign
They tell you.
contract, yeah, sure.
Yeah, but who reads all those pages?
I agree.
I don't know. Okay, but in the commercial space, forget the home building space, in the commercial space, especially if you're developing for yourself, you're not pushing the cost to anybody. Because at the end of the day, who's paying the assessment? You are. So it's a financing vehicle. At the end of the day, it's nothing but a financing vehicle. Okay? Did you have a question before on what you asked me on
I don't know what you're talking about.
community development districts?
I did.
So what these people did was,
Pass.
so there was a developer, I think it was Tucson, needed to build a bunch of infrastructure here, and they issued, I don't know, I'm gonna call it $100 million worth of CDD bonds, the bulk of which were bought by Goldman Sachs for their investors. And then this thing blew up. They never did this,
How did he get his hands on him? How did he?
Relax. So Tucson blows up, they never fulfill their obligations, but they'd issued the bonds and they'd collected cash. So now you've got a creditor which has rights on this. Now, I'm not an attorney, and the only reason Mr. Godino was able to do this is because Larry Gregg, who was a very intelligent guy who had just retired from White and Case, figured out how to get the rights that these people had to the land. And ultimately, so Armando had a relationship with Goldman, he paid them X cents on the dollar. Okay, they came to him and said, do you want to buy these? They weren't all the bonds outstanding, so issue number one is he had to go out there and buy the balance of the bonds. And now he was a preferential creditor. And there was a process that they went through in the bankruptcy court here where they ultimately exchanged that debt for a fee interest in the land. Okay?
Great.
And it was a 2 or 3 year process. And it's not clear cutting. I'm not an attorney, so I can't tell you specifically the preference on what the CDD bond has, because my understanding is it's a first lien on the CDD land and its improvements, but not on the balance of the site. But then there is a collateral one, because the source of income for the repayment of those bonds is the value that's elsewhere. So, again, you got to go to an attorney for that, to answer that question that you had. Okay, what else? What else? Warranties. So the only thing I want to add to warranties, and I only got a couple of you guys answered this right, from Merriam-Webster's. Warranty is a written statement that promises the good condition of a product and states that the maker is responsible for repairing or replacing the product, usually for a period of time after purchase. Okay? So a company goes through, they provide 1 to 3 years, blah, 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 blah. How does the company backstop its obligation under that? Now, a lot of you guys wrote, well, you know, they provide a warranty reserve against it. Well, that's just how they account what they're gonna pay. A couple of you guys, maybe it was the guys in the contracting business, figured out, and it wasn't a thing. You just gotta go back, you know, hopefully you establish a relationship with your subcontractor that you're pushing that risk on to the guy that's doing the work. And if you're an intelligent general contractor or developer, you're always gonna find somebody that is gonna stand behind the work that you're warrantying to somebody else. You know, you're building condos, hopefully you're pushing, you know, the ultimate obligation that you have down to somebody who did the work. And you're not, even though you provide the guarantee, you can ultimately go back to somebody else.
Who is that, somebody else?
A subcontractor.
Yeah, subcontract.
Oh, okay.
Now, they themselves said, they in their contract, they said that they maintained adequate insurance company against construction defects and bodily injury. You can't insure warranty risk. So there may be some insurance there, and it's the way they play with the words. There may be some insurance there against, like, you know, product that they, you know, like the mold kind of thing, you know, the Chinese drywall thing, but you can't buy coverage against your workmanship. I can tell you that. You cannot buy insurance coverage against your workmanship because insurance companies would go bankrupt, okay? Now, if you are a professional services provider in this industry, you can obtain E&O coverage, errors and omissions. And that's very common with architects and engineers because they can't sell their work without it. Because ultimately, what happens up front has a magnified effect at the end, and there needs to be some sort of coverage along the way. And you can't just say, oh, I'll redo the plans. You know, now you got costs, and that's where E&O for professional service providers, and it's expensive, but it's there. The debt is all fixed rate. Is it good or bad? It depends. You know, I don't have a right answer for that. My answer would be, with rates where they are today, and the potential upside of rates going down lower, or the risk of them going higher, the more you can pile on in long-term fixed rates, the better off you're going to be today. That would be my opinion. The report is issued to the board of directors and shareholders. Why? Why? It's very simple. Who owns the company?
Shareholders.
Who represents the ownership in a company?
Board.
So the shareholders vest their rights and obligations in a board of directors. What's the role of a board of directors?
Steer the ship.
To oversee management. Who runs the day-to-day business of the company?
Management.
Who's responsible for the financial statements of a company?
Management.
Management. So why does an auditor, who is hired by the audit committee of the board of directors, right, do an audit?
To confirm that management did cook.
Ultimately, to provide an opinion on the fairness of the financial statements, which are prepared by management. But the audit firm basically comes in and provides a level of comfort to the ownership and the representatives of the ownership about the integrity or the fairness of those financial statements that management is providing. Off-balance sheet transactions, operating leases, and land obligations, land purchase obligations. It's typical for land, for developers, home builders in particular, to secure their future inventory by paying a premium, a land, premium, an option on the right to take down land sometime in the future. There were some shenanigans in the mid-2000s where, their home builders are related parties to controlling interests in home builders were creating special purpose vehicles that were buying land and then entering into option agreements with the company. And I won't get into that, but some of the blow-ups in some of these companies were, they just signed too many agreements to buy too much land and promised too many specific returns to the people that were buying them. Impairment, I think most of you got that right.
First on that, so when they put down a deposit or at the option, where does that go?
It's an asset.
So would that just capitalize?
You capitalize it. The minute that option is lost, you expense it. If you close on it, it's just part of your cost of acquisition. And just to be, more specific or precise, what was happening, and I can tell you Lennar, for example, was one of the companies that was doing this. In fact, I'll tell you, Ronnie Cycli was one of the guys that was a promoter of one of these. So they'd create this special purpose vehicle out here that had this sort of informal relationship to the company. And so they'd go out and raise $100 million and buy, these parcels of land. And then they'd this entity would enter into an option agreement with Lennar that essentially guaranteed a rate of return to these investors. And what was the end result of all of that? They controlled land and didn't have the liability booked on the books, right? Now, the question becomes, is this a consolidatable entity and should we recognize that debt? And I think the answer is yes, and we'll go over FIN 46 in the last class on. But a lot of home builders were doing this to sort of obviate getting the land on their books. And the issue isn't getting the land on the books, the issue is having the liabilities on the books. That's the thing that concerns most people, okay? Segment information is important because it gives the reader a clearer, more detailed view about the different operations in a business. So segment information can be reflected geographically or by lines of business or by operating units, okay? Any questions on the case study? Maricela was very simple. I mean, you can tell her it wasn't hours and hours of work. Two quick subjects. I've only got about 45 minutes to go through them.
Oh. Eyes are closing.
I can't.
Review. Nice.
I can't. One of the things that we like to do is, as finance/accounting people, I'll read them out to you. One of the things we like to do is to observe relationships that exist within financial statements in order to understand or better understand what the performance or what the results of a particular business's activities or operations might be. As I mentioned, a lot of the times we do this because we want to not only benchmark with what we've done in the past or what our budget or future expectations were versus reality, we also want to benchmark against peers. And so the best way for every business is unique, right? So, how do I measure whether Pulte is better managed than Toll Brothers or Lennar, or is in better position? A lot of that has to do with, well, what's their financial performance, or what are their metrics in comparison to others? You can also compare against previous periods to see trends, and you can also compare against expectations, budgets. Easiest way to measure management's performance, right? Management, you told me you were going to deliver this, and you're actually delivering this. Is it over or is it under? Justin, what's your question?
How do you answer this? It was about the pattern I'm trying to. I know some of them are older than others, such as Toll and Styles, right? They've been in for 50
Well, first of all, like Styles is a merchant developer, Toll is a home builder, different business models. History is relative, right? And we can talk, I go back and forth on this when we do the capital markets class, and in particular, we talk about beta, for example. So history's good, and those who don't learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them again, right? So it's important to have long-term trends, but what happened 80 years ago probably has less relevance than what happened 8 years ago. It may be less relevant to what happened 8 months ago, right? So, you know, you always got to take a look at the period of time that you look and trailing periods to see how valuable that information is or isn't. Okay, so, you know, but you probably wouldn't want to go back more than 3 or 5 years max ever to sort of look at a trend. A lot of times people don't look back. Just to get a sense, SEC reporting has 3 years of income statements and 2 years of balance sheets. Now, I'm not suggesting that SEC reporting is the best, you know, way to take a look at trends, but that just kind of gives you an idea of, people don't go into too far distant past to take a look at trends, okay? I mean, this is stuff you guys all should have covered in, you know, one point or another in an undergraduate economics or finance or accounting class, but people go through or use ratio analysis, right? And again, these give us sort of insights, and I've kind of broken down, by the way, I always like to give credit. This particular presentation I kind of got from a CPE class that I did some years ago, so at least the sort of general format. But basically we take a look at liquidity, okay? How monetizable are my assets? I'll give you some ratios, quick ratios that we could use there. Activity, how effectively or efficiently is management utilizing the assets that have been that they've been entrusted with. Leverage is about who's got skin in the game, right? And what's the return all about, right? Profitability, obviously, how much is left after, you know, you sell. And then some other ones that people use that I, you know, always mention in this class in one way or another. I'm going to try to go through this quicker, so I'll kind of bypass the notes. But so liquidity, there are 2 or 3 very quick ratios. I should say quick ratios in that sense, easy ratios to learn. The first one is what people call the current ratio. A different view of that, but the same information, is taking a look at working capital. And then what other people say, and I alluded to this a little while ago, is people take a look at the quick ratio, right? There's a sort of modern day, and I cut it out, I just don't have time to go through it, is sort of modern day thinking is people are talking about something called the cash conversion cycle. Okay? Working capital. What is working capital? Does anybody remember working capital? It's an easy definition of working capital. Okay. Capital de trabajo. Hay gente que dice fondo de maniobra. I mean, it's all in Argentina. So in Argentina, that's what they call it. Okay, but that's just a literal translation. What is it?
No.
Isn't the amount of money that you need to kind of run stuff for an X period of time? Like,
Well, that's ultimately what it should tell you. There's an easy mathematical, it is current assets less current liabilities.
Yes.
Okay? And basically, current assets and current liabilities are assets that are monetizable in less than a year,
Yes.
and liabilities, current liabilities, are obligations that are payable or due within a year.
Yes.
Okay? And so to Chad's point, the implication of working capital is that is how much money you sort of have available, right?
To work.
During a course of an annual period, right? Which is ultimately breathing room, right? It's how much more do I have than what I owe currently. Now, careful, as I said, a lot of real estate companies don't classify their balance sheet. So in order to do this analysis, right, you kind of got to classify. What I mean by classification is they don't break, they go kind of in inverse order. A lot of capital intensive businesses will disclose their balance sheet in order of importance. So assets would start with their biggest asset, plant, property, and equipment. So REITs do that, utilities do that, okay? And And it worked then down to liquidity. Cash would be the last one. Most companies classify their balance sheet, so they'll put the most liquid assets first, and they're less liquid afterwards. Liabilities go the same way. REITs, utilities, and I will put mortgages or other debt obligations first and work down to current liabilities, okay? So less liquid to more liquid. So current assets less current liabilities equals working capital. What is the current ratio? Same information, but it's a ratio. So instead of a calculation,
Divide.
exactly. So you put current assets over current liabilities. What's the implication of that? If it's greater than 1, is it good or bad?
Good, good.
Good. Less than 1, it would be bad, right? It's like having negative working capital. If this is the implication of this being less than 1, it's not good, is it? Okay? Now, do you have a question?
Yeah, mine was on the balance sheet on the home builders, they were all negative.
We say they were all negative.
Well, WCI had negative balance sheet.
Negative balance sheet.
Negative is losses. Balance sheet. Negative.
What do you mean, you mean negative working capital?
Yeah, it was negative.
I find that hard to believe. I think we have to take a look at that again. Now, what may be negative in a home builder is people get concerned with how monetizable inventory is. Okay? And so people look at what they call a quick ratio, and so they'll say current assets less inventories divided by current liabilities. So they're going to say, hey, take out inventories. Let's say that these people have a problem with inventory. How liquid are they? Now, so are all these necessarily analyses that we do on real estate companies? The answer is probably not. But are these ratios that we should be comfortable with in our day-to-day life, and as operators of real estate businesses that are evaluating the financial statements of potential tenants, suppliers, vendors, etc., we need to be comfortable with these items. Okay? Yes, Chad?
I mean, wouldn't that last one be the most relevant for liquidity in real estate? Because in inventory, you can't liquidate it.
With a home builder, which is probably the only real sort of development type firm that should have a lot of inventory, yeah, quick ratio is very important to take a look at. Okay? Now, more recently, there's a sort of push towards current conversion or cash conversion cycle, and it's so what you're basically taking a look at are changes in accounts receivable versus changes in inventory versus changes in payables. Okay, I'm not gonna go over it in detail. I'm just letting you know people are starting to think and saying, okay, what are the trends in receivables, or what is the days sales outstanding or the average collection period in receivables versus the average turnover or conversion of inventory versus what my payment cycle is. Okay, so we're kind of looking at those 3 items as more of a measure of liquidity. Any more questions on liquidity, or any questions on liquidity?
The home builders, they don't really have receivables, do they?
No, not really. They shouldn't.
So back to your example with Lennar versus WCI, and why one of them went bankrupt. You're saying that Lennar had enough current assets to cover their inventory, and WCI did not.
Well, not to cover their inventory, to cover their obligations.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, but Lennar also morphed into a distressed property management.
Well, you say evolved. Lennar, back in the 80s, with Morgan Stanley, bought a bunch of distressed assets and ultimately spun that business out into what became L&R. So Lennar has always delved in, during financial crises in distressed assets. So yeah, they've created Rialto, they've done, yeah, it goes back to what we were saying before, you got to morph. But Lennar didn't survive because they had Rialto. Lennar survived because they had liquidity and because they had net worth, because they had sustainability, they had staying power. So they had properly structured debt agreements that didn't become due. They had enough liquidity to withstand the hurricane, you know, the storm. Activity ratios. So, you know, we could take a look at a, you know, again, turnover. People talk about turnover. So, you know, in the receivables realm, I'm just going to go over a couple of them, okay? In the receivables realm, there's a bunch of different ways to look at it, right? So, you can take a look at average collection period, right? And so average collection period is going to be, you know, sales divided by 365, right? And that's going to be divided by your average accounts receivable balance, okay? But what's more telling is people do something called days sales outstanding, and people look at an aging of accounts receivable. Okay? Days sales outstanding. Okay? So you're going to take your average sales, daily sales, and divide it by your ending receivable balance. And that's going to tell you I've got 47 days outstanding, or 67 days outstanding. And then you could say, okay, well, so a company finances 47 days worth of their sales. Is that good or bad? What are the terms under which they sell? What are other people in the industry paying?
Yeah.
Right? So that's what you got to take a look at, right? So if your terms with vendors are, or with clients is net 10 days and your average collection period is 90 days, you got a problem. Because people aren't paying you when you expect them to pay. If your day sales outstanding is 89 days and your average payables is 43, you got a problem. Because you're getting paid slower than you got to pay. That means you have to have more equity in the game. Make sense?
Yeah.
Another way that people look at receivables is by aging, and basically you're stratifying, okay? So people typically are going to look at a current period. Typically people would look at less than 30 days, between 30 and 60, between 60 and 90, and then beyond. It's common practice in this country. Okay? Tyler, you have a concern about this? Does it make sense? Why do we break them up into these periods?
Because they become more
different risk.
uncollectible the further they get out.
Because time is risk, right? Because the further you get out here, right, the greater the indication of what? There's a problem. For an invoice to be paid, two things have to happen. There needs to be ability, and what's the second one? Willingness.
Yeah.
Okay? So, the further it gets out here, the likelier that people can't pay you or don't want to pay you. Okay? There's another way to compose day sales outstanding, which is to actually build it based on your most recent monthly sales. So you don't have to use your sales for the year. You actually use last month's sales and the previous month's sale and the previous month's sale. I won't get into that, okay? Inventories, people talk about average days of inventory, right? You know, or you can take a look at the turnover. How often does it cycle, right? I won't go through the calculations because of time. Or how many days of inventory you have. You can also age inventory. Because again, the older your inventory is, the slower it turns, what are the implications?
The closing.
Obsolescence, damage, right? Lack of desire, loss in value, etc. Okay? You can do total asset turnover, how effectively your sales over total assets. So basically, activity is typically going to relate your sales to the assets, the efficiency with which you're using the assets, right? Management efficiency. Leverage. What do we talk about leverage? We talk about skin in the game. So when we talk about leverage, what are the common factors or ratios we talk about in leverage?
LTV,
Debt to equity? Debt to equity.
Yeah. What's LTV?
loan to value.
That's for housing,
I thought LTV was LaSalle Television. Sorry. No, debt to equity. Debt to equity. Loan to value is something different. Debt to equity. Okay, and there's a lot of different ways to look at that, right? So you can put it any way you want, right? So it's assets, debt, and equity, right? So there's a lot of different, you can compare debt to equity, right? So it could be like a sort of 1-to-1 or 2-to-1, right, ratio. Or it could be, what's the percentage of debt over debt plus equity or over assets, right? So, you know, is this 50% of your total capital stack? So you can relate one to the other, debt to equity, 1-to-1, 2-to-1, 3-to-1, or what percentage of your total capital stack is comprised of other people's money, right? And the point here is who's at risk. So you got $100 worth or 100% worth of assets. Whose money is at risk supporting those assets, right? So if you're a lender, what are you going to want? Likely, you're going to have lower leverage. You're going to say, I want that guy to have more skin in the game. There's impairment here. I'm more likely to be covered because you whittle away the equity first, right? So the other component of leverage that people look at is the ability to service that debt. And so people look at coverage ratios, fixed charge, debt service, interest coverage. People are looking for some multiplier or capacity of a business's cash flow to cover debt. So, you know, you got to be careful. A lot of you guys use, like, you want the Yahoo Finance or whatever and grab ratios and stuff. Don't use other people's ratios. Calculate your own, because you don't know what other people's ratios are doing, right? So a lot of times people look at debt to equity, but when they do debt to equity, they only consider long-term debt. Personally, I consider all debt, because whether it's current or not, you got to pay it. It's an obligation. It's somebody else's skin in the game. So, you know, my recommendation is compose your ratios based on the information that you're trying to interpret, and that you understand what it means. Okay? So, you know, so people are going to say, like, you know, net income over, let's just call it debt service, right? Let's call it P plus I, right? Principal plus interest. So how many times does my net income cover my debt service? It got hot again in here, didn't it?
They went through it all last Saturday.
Okay, so, but stop to think in the context of real estate. There's a lot of different ways to take a look at this, right? Because we could take a look at NOI over, you know, fixed charges. You know, you may have other charges, you know, PI plus something else, right? You may have some reserves that you got to establish. You may have interest-only debt, so only over interest. You could use other, you know, proxies for this. You could use FFO, right? But again, what you're trying to do is relate cash flow to obligation. And the question is how much cash flow do you have? How much margin do you have in order to meet the obligations that you have, right? In the real estate industry, you know, sort of standard rule of thumb was they should be able to cover this as a creditor by how many times or how much? What's the typical ratio that people have seen?
1.2.
1.2, 1.3, you know, something like that. People want some room in a trend, right, to be able to cover debt service. And again, part of the problem is banks need to be current on their loans, or they got to classify them. When they go out here on that 90, they got to start creating provisions for them. Okay, so it starts affecting their capital, which affects their ability to lend. Becomes very complicated after that. Profitability ratios are simple, right? So we talk about net profit margin. Actually, before that, we talk about gross margin. What's gross margin? What's gross margin? Class? 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 What's gross margin? We went through this the other day. Sales less cost of sales
Cogs.
The revenue.
equals gross margin. Why is this important? Sales are important because that's the dollar that everything else is subtracted from. But more important than that, gross margin is important because it's the amount of money that a sale leaves us in order to cover all of our fixed or G&A type costs, okay? So at the end of the day, the point is a lot of times, especially in publicly traded businesses, especially in growth businesses, people are looking at what are the trends in gross margin. How much of that sales dollar do they keep to fund R&D, to pay marketing costs, to pay their G&A, to distribute to shareholders, right? The higher the growth, the more innovative the business, typically the higher the gross margin. The more mature, the more competition, right? The more stale, the lower the gross margin, okay? But again, a more developed business has fewer marketing related costs and definitely fewer R&D costs, right? Innovation and development costs. What is net profit margin? Net profit margin. How about net income divided by sales? So what percentage of the dollar that I sold do I get to keep? 1%, 2%, 3%, 5%, 10%. Now, within this context, I wish I had the time to go over the DuPont model, right, and develop the whole ROE. But people talk about return on investment, and there's two sort of critical look at this, right? They can be further decomposed, but we got return on assets and return on equity, right? Net income over total assets. Net income over what? Return on equity. Net income over
Total equity.
equity, right? So this is a leveraged view of return, and this is my unleveraged view. Or you can look at it the other way, right? So what's the return on my bit, right? And what's the return overall on a business? ROE, probably the most important measure, okay? We can decompose this another day if time permits and use a DuPont model, but net income over equity. Net income over equity. Net income over equity. Yeah? Other measures that we use or have used in this class. Other. EPS. What does EPS stand for?
Earnings per share.
Earnings per share. And what is the definition of earnings per share? Or better yet, how do you calculate it? EPS. EPS. Earnings per share.
How many shares are outstanding divided by shares outstanding?
Sales. Earnings. What's earnings?
Net income.
Net income.
Over over total amount of shares.
Shares outstanding. usually the name will kind of lead you, point the way. Earnings, net income, right? So receipts are sales, earnings, income. Think about that. A lot of times journalists don't get that right. Net income over shares outstanding. What's dividend yield? Yield.
How much they return to the shareholders,
Over what? So it's the
or how many shares,
it's the dividend.
the amount of money.
Well, the
divided-
dividend per share, right?
Yeah,
Over how much?
Share price?
no, their amount of share, yeah. Share price.
Share price? So kind of take a look at this as like a cash on cash return if you want, right? The distribution or the dividend per share, excuse me, over the share price, right? I mean, you could do it overall, you could do, right, net income over equity, right? But because we're talking about publicly traded stock, we got to go to what the market value is a share at. Okay, so dividends per share over the individual share price. What's payout ratio? If you're a shareholder, you care about this.
How often they pay their.
Not how often.
Or what's the likelihood that they're gonna.
Not how likelihood. What's the percentage of what they earn that they distribute? So it would be, right, the dividend per share divided by the net income per share. Right? Or the earnings per share. So, you know, how much do they keep and how much do they send home? Right? And as a shareholder, what you want management is to send money home, right? So you want that distribution. Or you want a reinvestment to give me a higher return than what I can earn on my own. What other ones do we use here? PE. PE, we do use that one a lot. What is PE?
Price earnings ratio.
Okay, so what's price earnings? What's that? What's the implication? Well, let's just define it first. Remember, the name will give you the answer. Price earnings ratio, right? PE.
The share price over earnings.
Okay, so price over earnings. So if we're talking about price, we're talking about individual share price, right? So if we're talking about individual share price, we can't talk about net income in general. We need to talk about earnings per share. And what's the sort of implication of this? And that's kind of like how many times or how many years of earnings does it take for you to recoup your investment? It's kind of like a look at payback, right? I didn't talk about payback and investment, so that's in a different class. Okay, but and so, you know, my stock is trading at 20 times. That means it's 20 years of current earnings are going to pay me back for what I paid for this. And you know, when I said the other day, for example, the S&P is trading today at what average? It's right at 21 today, man. 20.97 right now. It hurts me every day. Okay? 20.97 times. Okay, that's pretty rich in historical terms. Again, this is, when you take a look at this, this is a relative valuation. This is the inverse of cap. What's cap rate? NOI, right? This is the inverse. PE is the inverse, essentially, of cap rate, right? Right? Because this is value divided by NOI, essentially, on a per share basis. Cap is the other way around. It's NOI divided by value, right? So PE is kind of the inverse of cap rate, okay? But again, it is a relative valuation. Just like cap rate gives you relative valuation of one unique building versus another unique building, PE gives you the relative valuation of a stock versus another similar company or versus historical trends, right? So the easiest and quickest way to see whether a stock is fairly valued or not is what's it trading at? What's the PE ratio? And what does that compare with the industry? And what does that compare with historical trends? Okay? Yeah? The only one that I want to, you guys have done this and other, you guys have done IRR, right?
Yeah.
What's IRR? Okay, internal rate of return. And what's the internal rate of return?
It's the rate on cash flows.
So and in real estate, in context of real estate, we basically say that the internal rate of return is our project return, right? Right? And what's the mathematical sort of explanation of this? The internal rate of return is the rate at which our net present value is 0. So the discount rate that gets your net present value to 0 is your internal rate of return. Now, if you haven't covered it yet, the one fallacy with internal rate of return is the assumption that that discount rate is what's being used to get you here is that you're reinvesting all that at the same rate of return, which you probably are not going to be able to do. So people use a modified IRR. I won't get into that, but the internal rate of return is our project return, and mathematically, it is the discount rate at which our net present value equals 0. Okay, so it's a discount rate. It's the discount rate at which we would be indifferent into making an investment or not. Right? Okay.
Can you provide just a quick, simple example of that? Like the most basic math calculation.
And I'll do that quickly.
Thanks.
Okay.
Okay, here's what I'm going to do, Chad. If you want to stay, I can show you a mathematical example. But I would hope that you're taking the investments class. Have you not gone over time value of money in the investments class?
He hasn't shown up.
He hasn't showed. No, he didn't explain.
Who hasn't showed, the professor or Chad?
This
No.
guy over here. This guy.
No one. The professor did.
The professor didn't show up either?
Not yet.
But has Fred come?
No,
No, it's a new one.
we've had class. We haven't gone over that.
No, it was just Chad. Chad's the only one.
Okay, it's critical because again, the problem is that IRR is the one measure, and again, unfortunately this isn't the investments class, okay? So you should dedicate a fair bit of time because IRR is also another relative measure to use in whether to go forward with a project or not, right? It's the one way of being able to measure projects one to another. So where you could say, this project is superior to this one because the rate of return on this project or the potential rate of return on this project is greater than this one. So when you're faced with comparison of what are not identical projects, it provides the relative balance to say, I opt for this one instead of this one, right? So, again, this is really, again, I think it's more the investments or the finance class, and it should, hold on, I'm going to go there, and it should be reinforcement of an undergraduate, sort of capital budgeting or finance class, which is to say, net present value of an investment over 0 should give you a yes decision because I'm going to make more, right, than what I invest. By the same sort of, analogy or methodology, right, an IRR greater than your cost of capital should hopefully be a yes decision as well. Okay? But are you covering IRR sort of like basic time value of money in investments or finance?
Part of it in finance, part of it in investment.
Okay, so you broke it, okay, all right. But Chad, again, IRR is critical because since every project is unique, it gives you the ability to compare one to another.
Right. I understand.
I really, really, really man, I mean, like, if it were,
really want to get the.
like, if it were up to me, like, I'd stay here another hour and go over this.
Let's do it.
When they cut the AC off, man.
The problem is the AC is pretty bad.
See the
So here's what we're gonna do. I've got a module, I think it fits in. I've got a module on credit analysis that I think fits in very nicely as a tail end of this, because as I say, we don't usually look at credit in a real estate class, but especially when we're operators of businesses, it's important to understand financial statements.
There's a fan over there. It's a commodity here.
Did you know the one with the abanico the other day?
Yeah, I have it, but this is better.
Okay. Especially when we were talking about earlier, TI and abatements and, you know, other allowances that we can make. It's really critical and important to be able to understand a company's financial position in order to make intelligent decisions. So much more on a sort of property management or asset management or ongoing level, figuring out or going through a thought process or analysis on do we give credit or not is important.
Yes.
And I have a case study on that, which I was going to send you tomorrow.
Oh, yeah.
But since it wasn't going to be due next week, because you've got another one due next week, I'll push the thoughts on this till the next class, and you'll just have to do 2 case studies next class as opposed. But you've got 3 weeks. You've got 3 weeks after the next class, so you'll have 3 weeks to do 2 case studies, which are really simple anyway. And more than that, they're a lot of fun. The next ones are really a lot of fun. Well, you're not going to like the next one. You're not going to like, but it's going to be very educational.
Worse than this last one?
The top or the next one?
It's easier.
Okay, good. Very
Are
great.
you sure it's tomorrow?
Can I send it to you like right this minute?
No.
You want me? I can do it right now. I've got the resources. I can rebuild it. No, I'll send it tomorrow.
I will multiply for that factor with the number of hours that you put in and that we can.
Oh, the next one coming up is easier. This is less.
Good.
It's less. Okay, so.
Always easy.
So I'm going to leave, listen, I'm going to leave credit analysis, the conversation on credit analysis for next class, and I'll send a case study. That one really is a quick case study, but it's sort of thinking. It really, there's not a lot of, it's more thinking than anything else.
Good, good.
And then we'll cover development costs next week, and we'll start sort of
Next week.
next session. And so we'll go to the quiz. Now, before we go through the review of the quiz, we've covered a little bit of material today, not as much as I would have wanted. But do we have any questions? No questions?
Did you do a review for the quiz?
Yeah, I'll do a review for the quiz, but do we have any questions?
This quiz, you're gonna do a review? I gotta use the restroom real quick.
Yeah,
I don't want to miss anything.
Okay, but why don't you wait till I give a break?
All right.
Just wait a couple minutes. I got to use the restroom too.
All right, cool. I'm with you.
Do we have any questions? Nothing. On everything we've covered today is crystal clear.
No.
Earnings per share.
It's not, it's clear.
So what you want me to do is, what you want me to do is go through the questions that I'm going to ask you, tell you the answers, so that I can ask you the questions. That's really what you want, is the review.
That's how I learned the best.
That's how you learn the best.
You know, like the study guys, you end up learning.
Okay,
all the
listen,
stuff.
here are the things we went through today, okay? We talked about leases, right? We talked about the fact that, accounting for leases is an evolving concept. It impacts lessors and lessees. That we've got some new regulation coming out at some point that's going to change the way we account for things in this country. But the sort of, important things to remember is that there are classifications between what are operating leases, which are more like right-to-use agreements, true right-to-use agreements for a period of time, right? And we talked about, in real estate, the concept of the asset that was being given the right was land and buildings, land building and improvements, land building improvements and FF&E, or parts of a building, right? So we talked about that. And we also talked about that in addition to that right to use, financial innovation brought about leasing as a vehicle for financing. And so the accounting world tried to grab the substance of that and say, if a lease really is more of a financing arrangement than it is a right to use for a period of time, then we're going to account for that in a different way. And in the context of a lessee, that was a capital lease. And the most important implication of the difference of accounting for that was that operating leases were expensed currently, whereas capital leases, you had an obligation to create a liability for your future obligations under the lease. And we talked about sort of 4 criteria for the distinction between an operating and a capital lease. And we talked about transfer title. We talked about bargain purchase price at the end of a lease. We talked about a lease being for longer than 75% of the economic life of the asset. And we talked about the payments, the net present value of the payments, or the minimum lease payments, being equal to or greater than 90% of the fair market value of the asset. And we talked about, as it related to land, only the title conditions, needed to be met. Okay, so I think that's what we talked about with leases, right? We went over the case study that we went, right? So we looked at a 10K. We looked at the different components of a 10K, right? There were sections on properties, descriptions of businesses, risk factors. Management went through a whole process of discussion and analysis. There were financial statements, things like that. Okay? Any questions on that? You want me to give you the real question?
Yeah.
Question number 7. No. Okay.
You set us up.
And then we talked about the use of ratio analysis, right? Relationships that exist between components of financial statements in order to benchmark what an operation of a business was versus its past, versus expectations, and versus a peer group. Okay, we talked about liquidity ratios, we talked about activity ratios, we talked about leverage ratios, we talked about profitability ratios, and we added some other ones. We talked about earnings per share, price earnings ratio, dividend yield, payout ratio, right? We mentioned cap rate, we talked about IRR, right, the internal rate of return. We talked about return on equity and return on assets. Ultimately, we were looking at the efficiency of management, the efficiency of operations, whose money was at risk, right, and the company's ability to meet its obligations. And I sort of went backwards from my original description on that. Any other questions? Any questions on any of the ratios we went over? So liquidity ratios, we talked about working capital, we talked about current ratio, we talked about quick ratio. Leverage ratios, we talked about debt to equity or debt to total assets. We talked about coverage ratios, right? Net income over P&I or some fixed charge, some obligation. So what was the company's ability to meet its future obligations? Activities, we talked about specifically receivables. We talked about days sales outstanding. We talked about aging of receivables. We talked about inventory turnover or average days of inventory or the aging of inventory. Okay, we talked about total asset turnover. What else? I mean, are you guys saturated?
Yeah.
It's gonna be fun.
Let's do it, it's probably a lot more.
Okay, why don't we take 5 minutes and then we got a little quiz after that.
I'm sure we're gonna become proficient at this sooner or later, but right now we're gonna need to know the calculations for this.
Maybe for some of them.
So I got a couple questions.
Okay. Okay, next question.
I don't even know what our number is.